It's summer, 1789. The fields around Nether Stowey are green and heavy with life. Bees hum in the hedgerows, the air thick with the smell of grass and wood smoke. And somewhere, among the trees on the slopes of the Quantock hills, between the parishes of Over and Nether Stowey, smoke curls upwards from the dark. It's not the smoke of chimneys, but of charcoal clamps. Low, smouldering mounds tended to day and night by men blackened with soot. Men who lived half in the world and half outside of it. The charcoal burners of the Quantocks were the hidden hands of the local economy. Men like John Walford. The charcoal they made fed forges, lime kilns and copper smelters. They made the fuel that made the world turn. To make charcoal you need patience and heat. Wood was stacked in circular piles around a central post, covered with moss and earth until the mound was airtight. It was lit in the centre, and then for 6 days, or sometimes up to 6 weeks, the burner would watch it smoulder, turning the wood inside into the black gold of the industrial age. They lived beside the fires in makeshift huts of branches and turf, close to water in a place known as Five Lords. They were alone, awake through the night, listening to the hiss of smoke and the whisper of the wind in the trees. It was a hard and lonely life, one that left little room for company or comfort. John Walford was one of these men, a man born to the woods, the son of a charcoal burner, raised in the shadows of the Quantocks. He worked in Five Lords, not far from the hamlet of Bingham, where his parents lived, and where he also rented a small cottage made of a single room and a low, thatched roof. 6 days of the week he lived and worked with his fires in the woods, only venturing from the solitude on Sundays to attend church. By all accounts he was well liked, good-humoured, quick to help a neighbour, and a favourite of all, so a friend would later write. But this quiet corner of Somerset was not as peaceful as it looked. Beneath the birdsong and the green and purple hills ran a network of mines and mills, copper shafts cutting deep into the ground, and 6 fulling mills thrumming along the streams that ran through the shallow valleys, washing the wool from nearby farms. Smoke, noise and labour filling the valley. It was a place of industry and of poverty, and in that tension between beauty and hardship, something terrible was about to happen. Something that would scar the maps of Somerset for centuries. A body by a gate. A husband accused. A verdict of hanging. And a poet to remember. This is THISTORY, exploring local history with me, Alasdair MacIlleathain, and tonight we walk the lanes of Over and Nether Stowey, through the smoke and the silence, to hear the story of John Walford and Jane Shorney, and the hill that still bears his name. John Walford's life was bound to the Quantocks. He was born here in 1762, in the parish of Over Stowey, the son of another charcoal burner, the kind of man who worked until his hands were black with soot and his lungs were full of wood smoke, his life soundtracked by the hiss and pop of carbonisation. By the 1780s, John was in his 20s, athletic, nimble and strong, a favourite of all, remarkable for his good temper and generosity, despite possessing ardent feelings and strong passions. These words are how he was described by his childhood friend, Thomas Poole, a local tanner, writer, activist and philanthropist who would later become entwined with other notable figures such as Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who also lived in Nether Stowey for a short time. It was Thomas Poole who would later write down much of John's story and pass it on to other writers and poets of the century. Perhaps it was even he who first gave the story its hints of tragedy and romanticism. John, like many others, had a sweetheart, Anne Rice, the daughter of the miller at Adscombe. Their love was genuine and strong, so much so that everyone had expected the two to marry. But somewhere along the way, another woman entered John's life, and her name was Jane Shorney. Jane was not the kind of woman who was widely respected in society. She was poor, uneducated, and described rather cruelly as a slow, slovenly and stupid creature. Even William Wordsworth would write a poem about her, the title slating her as the idiot girl. It's a glimpse of how society saw her. Perhaps true, perhaps not. But whatever they thought, in the winter of 1784, Jane visited John in his woodland hut. Was it love, curiosity, or simple warmth for the cold months? We can't know for certain, but soon after their little winter warming rendezvous, Jane became pregnant. In 18th century Somerset, this was a disaster. Pregnancy outside of marriage was a social scandal. For the parish, it meant cost, having to pay the financial support of a mother and a child in a time where women could not work. However, there was another solution. Under the laws of the time, the overseers of the poor had the power to imprison a man if he impregnated a woman outside of marriage. He would be given a simple choice: marry the woman or provide financial support himself, or he would end up in prison. However, John was unwilling or unable to do so. He was briefly arrested until his mother came to his rescue, agreeing to pay for the child's upkeep herself, allowing for his release from both the iron bars of prison and the wooden door of matrimony. Jane would go on to give birth to a son, but it wasn't long before she was pregnant again. This time, however, the father was John's brother, William. William refused to marry Jane, instead opting to pay himself to keep his freedom. But somehow, the threads of John and Jane's lives remained tangled. By 1787, John became engaged to his sweetheart, Anne Rice, but it was only a few weeks before the engagement ended for unknown reasons, although it has been suggested that his mother opposed. And when Jane appeared again later that year, she fell pregnant with another child, John's. But this time, John was unable to avoid the consequences. On June the 10th, 1789, John Walford married Jane Shorney in Over Stowey at the Church of St. Peter and St. Paul. He was 27 years old, and she was the mother of 2 children, pregnant with her third. Their arrangement was strange from the start. Jane and her children were to live with her mother, and Jane was only allowed to visit John at his rented cottage in Bingham at night. Their marriage wasn't to last long. Within 17 days of marriage, on the 27th of June, John visited his friend William Bishop at the Dial Inn in Ailey Green. He planned and begged his friend to move with him to London to get away from his trapped life with Jane. However, William was unable to afford to join him. John admitted to William that he did not like his wife, and that he would either have to murder her or leave the area. The truth, or an exaggeration? William wasn't to know, but it was clear that John's marriage was far from paradise. On the evening of Saturday the 4th of July 1789, John Walford walked home through the trees, his clothes streaked with charcoal dust. At 8 p.m. he ate supper with the family of one of his co-workers and neighbours, the Rich family, before crossing the lane to his own cottage in Bingham at around 10:30. Jane joined him not long after, the lamps lit and the door closed. No one knows what was said or what happened next, but by morning, 2 children playing on Doddington Common would find blood on the ground, trickling under a gate, and then the body of a woman, the body of Jane Shorney. The evening before, as John would come to admit, Jane joined him, wanting to go to the Castle of Comfort Inn at Doddington for some cider. John was exhausted from a long day's work and gave her a shilling so she could go herself. She begged him to walk with her as it was dark, and she didn't want to walk through the lanes alone. Reluctantly, he escorted her through the peaceful evening countryside, but their journey was far from tranquil. He said that she lured him into an argument. What it was about is unknown. However, it was said that she often taunted him about Anne, that she was his wife and not the woman he loved. Perhaps it was this that she said that night. Perhaps she laughed at him, at his misfortune, her success in trapping him in marriage. But whatever was said, it struck a nerve. As they reached the counting house on Doddington Common, the argument came to a head, and words soon turned to blows. John struck her, first with his fists, and then in a burst of rage he picked up a heavy, rough wooden post from a nearby fence, bringing it down on her head. The first strike fractured her skull, the second likely killed her. He stood there, breathing hard, the moonlight catching the blood that splattered onto his hands. The reality would have quickly set in. Jane lay there, half on the path and half on the grass, her hair matted with blood. In either panic or cold calculated movements he tried to drag her body to an old copper mine shaft only 100 metres away, a structure that still stands today, but her limp body proved too heavy and the ground too soft. Instead, he took a pocket knife, and in a final act of horror, perhaps for a cover story, or in hatred, cut her throat. He dumped her body behind a gate at the counting house, and by 12:30 a.m. he was home. He took his bloody clothes and hid them between the ceiling and the thatch of his cottage and fell asleep. By dawn her body was found, 26 years old and 5 months pregnant. By noon the whole parish would have known. News spreads fast in small communities, and it didn't take long for a knock to come at John Walford's door. John Mogg and William Selleck, two neighbours at Doddington Common who had been alerted and first found the body, visited John to break the news that his wife was dead, found with her throat slit by Doddington Common. They couldn't have imagined that he had done it. He explained to them that the night before she wanted cider, so he gave her a shilling and she left to get some at the Castle of Comfort. But when she didn't return, he assumed that she had returned to her mother's. They were initially satisfied, and John left to visit his mother-in-law to break the news himself. Along the road he met a woman named Sarah Phillips. In a brief conversation, John hinted at his unhappiness, and admitted that he wished he'd never married Jane, and that he should have left the area a long time ago. Probably not the smartest move. He broke the news to his mother-in-law, perhaps also the children, and the two travelled to the scene of the murder. There were no signs of robbery, no shilling in her pocket, contrary to what John had told people, and the wounds, they were brutal, done with hatred. An inquest was called the same day at Nether Stowey, a community investigation that would take place before the establishment of a police force, where evidence would be collected and passed to a judge at a later time for a verdict to be found and a sentence to be passed. It was led by William Blake, the coroner, and attended by many notable faces from the community, including John's childhood friend, Thomas Poole. Thomas interrogated John. Why didn't he go searching for his wife? Where was the shilling that he gave her? Suspicion began to grow. Thomas Poole and two other men escorted John back to his cottage and carried out a search, soon discovering the hidden, bloody clothes in the ceiling, the shilling still in the pocket, as well as mud-caked boots that proved he had left the cottage the night before. They demanded to find the knife, but John claimed he had lent it to another man. But a few days later, in another search, it was found under a window seat, stained with dark, dried blood. John was arrested and taken to the Globe Inn at Nether Stowey, where he was kept under guard until the coroner and inquest had reached a final verdict. It came quickly. Willful murder. He was sent to Ilchester Jail to await the upcoming summer assizes in Bridgewater, but the story is far from over. The trial took place on the 18th of August 1789, the court crowded with people desperate to see the man who had committed the murder. Presiding over the court was Lord Chief Justice Lord Kenyon, a stern man with a sharp sense of order. The court heard from a dozen witnesses or so. Joan Rich and her daughter who had eaten supper with John the night of the murder, John Mogg and William Selleck who had found the body, Sarah Phillips who had had the unsettling conversation with John the morning after the murder, and finally Thomas Poole, a friend who had spoken highly of John's personal character, but this time offered a reserved promotion. Numerous other witnesses were called, friends, even family, but John's case was not strong. His story shifted and faltered. At first he claimed that Jane was murdered by another man, then he implicated his own brother, and later he would claim that Jane had taken her own life, admitting that she had, in his own words, done him a good chore by slitting her own throat. It was desperate, contradictory, and utterly damning. The evidence was clear. Despite testimony to his good character, the jury took little time to return with a guilty verdict. It was said that Lord Kenyon's eyes filled with tears as he sentenced John to death, perhaps moved by the character witnesses, or perhaps in relief. Perhaps this is even a romanticism that would appear later. Whichever the case, John was to be hanged the following Thursday, and on the morning of August 20th, John Walford was led from his cell and placed in a cart, its destination, the gallows. A gallows was built atop a hill overlooking Bincombe and Doddington, in sight of his own home, as well as the front door of his parents' cottage, on the edge of the woodland where he had spent his life working. While the final preparations were made, John was paraded in the cart and left on show outside the Globe Inn at Nether Stowey. Anne Rice made her way to him, pushing through the crowd of hundreds. They spoke briefly before the cart began its final journey, the crowd following. No one knows what was said. As the cart arrived at the gallows, Anne managed to speak with John again, supposedly in a passionate, tender conversation which proved the genuity of John and Anne's love. It moved the crowd, some to tears. 3,000 had gathered to watch John Walford hang, to mock and to jeer, but witnessing John in the flesh with the woman he loved changed their hearts. John stepped onto the gallows and the executioner placed the rope around his neck, the plume of charcoal smoke erupting from the woodland behind him. As he fell, the rope snapping under the weight of his body, the crowd that had come to shout was instead silent, praying for his soul. He hung for 20 minutes. While many executed criminals were taken for dissection, the parish had requested that John Walford be gibbeted, his body placed in an iron cage and hung as a warning for anyone else who committed a crime. There, on the hill where he was executed, his body hung for a year, haunting his parents' door since they couldn't leave the house without being faced with his hanging and decomposing corpse. The wooden gibbet eventually rotted, and the cage fell exactly a year and a day after he had been hung out as a warning. He was buried where it landed, and although his body and the gallows are long gone, the place became known as Walford's Gibbet, a name that still scars maps today. Jane Shorney was buried on the 9th of July 1789 in the churchyard of St. Peter and St. Paul's in Over Stowey, the same church in which she had been married not even a month earlier. She was 26 and still pregnant with her third child. Anne Rice, the woman that John had loved, gave birth to a daughter in Stagursey in November of 1789. In February of 1790, she died in Nether Stowey in the shadow of John's gibbet. Years later, a young poet, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, visited Nether Stowey. He lived in the town for 3 years, drawn to the landscape of the area, the Quantocks, the dark woods. Thomas Paul told him the story of John Walford, Anne Rice and Jane Shorney, a story that Coleridge later shared with his publisher John Cottle as the two ventured to the site of the gibbet. Witnesses to the execution and to the haunting reminder of the murder on the hillside stated that John Walford looked better hanged than most men look alive, and Coleridge wrote that John was the finest looking man ever to be hung. A strange remark, but one that revealed how the story of a brutal murder had transformed into a story of tragedy, of love gone wrong, of a good man driven by passion and circumstance. It was an easy story to romanticise, and in time that's exactly what happened. Wordsworth called Jane the idiot girl, Poole pitied John's circumstance, and Coleridge saw a tragedy. But the truth perhaps lies in between. Jane Shorney may not have been a simple fool as described. She was poor, vulnerable and desperate, but she was also persistent to survive in a world that gave her few choices. And John Walford, was he truly a victim of entrapment, of pride and temper? He did, after all, state that he would have to leave the parish or murder her, and he did not leave. The hill now sits in silence, almost eerie, but if you listen carefully you can hear the creak of wood and iron. You can feel the gentle rattle of shadows swaying amongst the trees where the gibbet swung, and it's even said that you can still hear the faint patter of John's footsteps, his restless soul never fully at peace. Two centuries have passed since that night. The woods have grown quiet, the mines are gone, and the charcoal fires have become cold. But the name remains, Walford's Gibbet. Two simple words on a map marking a story that most have forgotten. Yet here history never disappears. It lingers in the soil, in the names that we stop seeing and reading for what they are, in the places that we pass without remembering what once happened. Every field, every hill, every quiet little gateway has a story, just waiting to be explored, to be told, to be remembered. And that's the thing about local history. It's never truly gone. It's just waiting for someone to listen.